Her husband traded her for his secretary, then she exposed the secret that ruined his life. The silence between Eleanor and Daniel grew heavier with each passing day. What once was a marriage filled with shared dreams and whispered plans had become a house echoing only the sound of avoidance. Eleanor spent her evenings staring at the empty chair across from her, where Daniel used to sit with a glass of wine and a warm smile. Now, he barely acknowledged her presence, choosing to retreat into his phone or his mysterious late-night meetings. The feeling of isolation gnawed at her heart, but Eleanor, proud and patient, chose to endure, hoping it was just a phase born of stress and long work hours. Daniel had changed so gradually that Eleanor almost missed it. The subtle shift in his tone, the way his eyes no longer lit up when she spoke, the growing number of times he would arrive home late with vague explanations. Eleanor, a woman who had built her life around loyalty and trust, told herself stories to bridge the gaps his behavior created. It was easier to believe that Daniel was overwhelmed at work than to face the possibility that love, once vibrant and alive between them, might be quietly dying before her eyes. The weekends that once belonged to shared breakfasts and quiet walks in the park became Daniel's work emergencies and client meetings. Eleanor stopped asking after the third time he brushed her off with a perfunctory kiss on the forehead and a distracted promise to make it up to her. She sat alone on the porch swing, cradling a cup of tea that grew cold in her hands, staring out into the endless gray of the cloudy sky. Her heart felt heavier than the air around her, and though the words screamed inside her mind, she never voiced them aloud. Evenings passed like ghostly reruns of a life Eleanor barely recognized. She tried to fill the void by throwing herself into hobbies, reaching out to old friends, and volunteering at local charities. Still, nothing could silence the gnawing worry that Daniel's absence was not just physical but emotional too. She found herself tracing the lines of their wedding photo with trembling fingers, whispering silent prayers to the universe that whatever had built a wall between them could still be torn down. It was during one of her weekly visits to the local bookstore that Eleanor first overheard it. Two women from the neighborhood, standing near the entrance with coffee cups in hand, speaking in hushed, gleeful tones. Eleanor only caught fragments of their conversation, but the words Daniel, new secretary, and spending a lot of time together seared into her mind like brands. She pretended to browse through a shelf of gardening books while her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear it. For a long moment, Eleanor stood frozen, torn between walking away and confronting them, demanding to know exactly what they meant. Instead, she quietly left the store, her breath shallow and uneven, and stumbled into the cool air outside. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, trying to contain the storm raging within her. Deep down, part of her had known. But hearing it confirmed, even through casual gossip, tore something inside her that she had been desperately holding together. The following Saturday morning, Eleanor woke up to an empty house. Daniel's car was gone from the driveway, and he had left no note, no message, nothing. She sat at the kitchen table in her robe, staring blankly at the untouched breakfast she had prepared. Pancakes, fresh fruit, coffee, all the little things he used to love, now sitting there like a mockery of her efforts. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the cold indifference with which he now treated the life they had built together. Hours ticked by with no word from him. Eleanor tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. She sat in the living room, phone clutched tightly in her hand, feeling like a fool. When Daniel finally returned late that evening, he offered no apology, just a distracted excuse about a last-minute business trip. Eleanor didn't argue. She simply nodded, feeling something inside her, the last thread of hope, perhaps, snap quietly, leaving behind only a hollow ache where love once lived. 2 weeks later, Eleanor found the divorce papers casually placed on the kitchen counter, weighted down by a half-empty coffee cup. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a cruel brightness over the scene that made her feel sick. There was no note, no explanation, only Daniel's neat, impersonal signature on the line that marked the end of their marriage. Eleanor stood there for a long time, staring at the papers, feeling as if the earth had tilted beneath her feet. When Daniel finally walked into the room, adjusting his tie with a smug grin, he didn't even meet her eyes. "It's for the best, Eleanor," he said dismissively, as though he were discussing the cancellation of a subscription rather than the shattering of 2 decades of shared history. Eleanor said nothing. She simply gathered the papers, her fingers steady despite the turmoil inside her, and walked away, her heart burning not with sorrow, but with the first embers of something else. Something stronger. The final humiliation came sooner than Eleanor had expected. Daniel insisted they meet at their favorite cafe, the one where they had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, to discuss things like adults. Eleanor arrived early, heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird, only to find Daniel already there, laughing openly with a much younger woman. As she approached, he barely glanced up, waving a dismissive hand as if she were an inconvenient stranger. When she sat down, Daniel wasted no time introducing his secretary, Melissa, as the real reason for his newfound happiness. Customers at nearby tables turned their heads, their curious glances cutting deeper than knives. Eleanor sat frozen, the cup of untouched coffee in front of her growing cold. Melissa smirked arrogantly, resting her manicured hand on Daniel's arm as he spoke of moving on, of building a future with someone who truly understood him, each word stripping another piece of Eleanor's dignity away. Eleanor endured the charade with quiet grace, even as Daniel leaned back in his chair, wearing the smug smile of a man who thought he had won. Every so often, Melissa would whisper something into his ear, and Daniel would chuckle cruelly, glancing at Eleanor as if to ensure she caught the moment. The cafe, once a place filled with happy memories, had transformed into an arena of humiliation, with Eleanor standing alone at the center. When Daniel pushed the finalized divorce documents across the table, he did so with a condescending grin. "Sign these quickly, Eleanor. You'll want to move on too, eventually," he said, as if he were granting her a favor. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply took the papers, her expression unreadable. Inside, however, a new clarity began to form, a silent promise to herself that her story would not end with a signature on a page or a pitiful glance from a man who had never truly deserved her. The small town Eleanor called home wasn't big enough to shield her from the news. Whispers of Daniel's whirlwind romance with Melissa spread like wildfire through their community, leaving Eleanor to endure pitiful glances from acquaintances who didn't know how to offer comfort without reopening wounds. Melissa seemed to enjoy the attention, appearing at every social event with Daniel, clinging to his arm like a trophy won through scandal. Eleanor retreated inward, seeking solace in long walks through the park and endless hours lost in old novels. She refused to become the broken woman Daniel likely expected her to be. Pain still bloomed inside her like a cruel flower, but alongside it grew an iron resolve. If Daniel wanted to believe he had traded her in for something better, Eleanor decided she would make sure he one day understood exactly what he had lost. Returning home one afternoon, Eleanor found herself locked out of the house she had lived in for 20 years. The locks had been changed, and a mocking note was taped to the door, "Find somewhere else to haunt." The cruelty of it nearly knocked the air from her lungs. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, some with pity, others with judgment, as she stood on the porch, suitcase in hand, realizing she had been discarded like yesterday's news. Rather than break down in the street, Eleanor turned calmly and walked away, dignity intact even as her heart shattered anew. She made her way to a small motel on the outskirts of town, the kind that smelled faintly of old carpets and desperation. Sitting on the lumpy bed, Eleanor allowed herself a single tear before pulling out her laptop. She would not beg Daniel for anything. She would build something better, with or without the ruins he had left behind. It was a rainy afternoon when Eleanor found herself in the town's only coffee shop, sipping weak tea and staring blankly out the window. She wasn't trying to listen, but the familiar voice from the next booth was impossible to ignore. Daniel was there, laughing with an old business partner, speaking freely as if the world were his playground. "She's nothing without me," Daniel scoffed. "She doesn't even know I've been diverting assets for months." Eleanor sat very still, every muscle in her body tense with rage and disbelief. In a single careless conversation, Daniel had confirmed every suspicion she hadn't dared voice. He hadn't just abandoned her emotionally, he had stolen from her, too. The betrayal cut deeper than anything else, but rather than crumble, Eleanor felt something rare and dangerous rise within her. The game had changed, and for once, she would be the one writing the rules. That night, Eleanor could barely sleep. Her mind replayed Daniel's cruel words over and over until anger burned hotter than grief. He hadn't just betrayed their marriage, he had robbed her trust, her future, and her sense of justice. Eleanor realized she could no longer remain passive. She would not be a silent casualty of his arrogance. She sat at the small motel desk, a single lamp casting a dim glow as she made lists, reviewed old documents, and began piecing together the fragments of a plan. Morning found her tired but filled with a strange energy. Every receipt, every property record, every business document Daniel had carelessly left around during their years together became valuable ammunition. Eleanor combed through emails, bank statements, and legal files, uncovering layers of deceit that made her stomach turn. There, buried among the mundane, was something explosive, an asset Daniel had hidden, one that legally belonged to her as much as to him. Days later, Eleanor requested a formal meeting with Daniel through their attorneys. The request was delivered with enough formality that Daniel, curious and cocky, agreed instantly. On the morning of the meeting, Eleanor dressed carefully. She wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry, no makeup beyond a touch of lipstick. There was strength in her simplicity, a stark contrast to the gaudy new life Daniel paraded with Melissa by his side. When Eleanor entered the meeting room, Daniel lounged arrogantly across from her, Melissa perched at his side like a smug accessory. Their lawyer, a sleek man with cold eyes, offered Eleanor a thin smile, certain she was about to be crushed. Eleanor simply nodded, calmly setting her thick folder on the polished table. No theatrics, no anger. Just a quiet certainty that made Daniel frown slightly, though he quickly masked it with a smirk. Eleanor's motel room became a war room, scattered with papers and scribbled notes. She spent hours poring over legal codes and consulting discreet attorneys who specialized in asset recovery. She worked alone, fueled by betrayal and the fierce determination to reclaim her life. Some nights, the weight of loneliness pressed so hard against her chest that it physically hurt, but Eleanor welcomed it. Pain had become her catalyst for change. There was a stark kind of freedom in having nothing left to lose. Eleanor realized she could rebuild her life in any image she chose, no longer tethered to the expectations Daniel had suffocated her with. She started sketching ideas for a small business, a consulting agency for women rebuilding after divorce. If anyone understood how it felt to have everything ripped away, it was Eleanor. And she was done being silent about it. The lawsuit Eleanor prepared took months to finalize, but she approached every hurdle with patience and quiet fury. Every document filed, every deposition taken, strengthened her case. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed blissfully unaware, believing himself untouchable in his arrogance. He paraded Melissa around town, smug in his belief that he had left Eleanor broken and humiliated. What Daniel didn't realize was that his own carelessness would be his downfall. Eleanor had found records of the shady business deals he had conducted, the hidden properties bought under shell companies, the funds quietly transferred to overseas accounts. Each discovery sharpened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for what was rightfully hers anymore. She was fighting for every woman who had ever been discarded and silenced. Late one afternoon, Eleanor received an unexpected call. It was from Sophia, Daniel's former business partner's wife. A woman who had once been part of the social circle that had shunned Eleanor after the divorce. Now, Sophia's voice was trembling with urgency and regret. "I've heard what you're doing," she said, "and I have something you need to see." Eleanor hesitated, years of betrayal making trust difficult, but something in Sophia's tone convinced her to listen. They met in the back corner of a quiet bookstore, where Sophia handed Eleanor a thick envelope. Inside were copies of emails, transaction records, and private correspondences that proved Daniel's financial misconduct was even worse than Eleanor had imagined. Sophia whispered, "He ruined more lives than just yours. We all stayed quiet because we were scared. But you're doing what we couldn't." Eleanor nodded, feeling the power of solidarity ignite something deep inside her. Armed with new evidence, Eleanor pressed forward. Every meeting with her attorney brought new revelations and clearer strategies. She learned to speak their language, to understand the nuances of contracts, loopholes, and legal traps Daniel had once used against her. Slowly, the ashes of her former life began to take shape into something new, something powerful. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about restoration, about reclaiming her identity and dignity. Even as Eleanor focused on the lawsuit, she quietly began laying the foundation for her future business. She rented a tiny office downtown, sparsely furnished but brimming with possibility. Every evening, after hours spent in legal meetings, she sat at the creaky desk, drafting business plans and outlining services. She envisioned a network that could support women stepping into the ruins of broken marriages and finding their strength again, just as she had. In the process of building her case, Eleanor stumbled upon a document that stopped her cold. Buried in the records Sophia had given her was proof that Daniel had forged her signature to secure a secondary mortgage against their home. The betrayal was so staggering that Eleanor had to sit down, hands trembling, as she reread the paperwork. It wasn't just theft or deception. It was a violation of trust so profound that it took her breath away. Tears threatened to spill over, but Eleanor clenched her jaw and willed them back. She refused to give Daniel the satisfaction of breaking her spirit again. Instead, she methodically added the new evidence to her legal arsenal. Daniel had built his empire on lies, and now every single one would be dragged into the light. Eleanor wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting to reveal the man he truly was to everyone he had fooled. Among the assets Daniel thought he had hidden was a downtown commercial building, small but valuable. What he didn't realize was that his reckless financial maneuvers had accidentally left Eleanor a silent majority stakeholder. When her attorney confirmed it, Eleanor smiled for the first time in weeks, a slow, genuine smile that reached her weary eyes. She hadn't just uncovered a weapon, she had uncovered a key to her own freedom. Quietly, Eleanor initiated proceedings to legally seize control of the property. She didn't announce it, didn't flaunt it. She waited patiently, letting the pieces move into place. Daniel continued to parade his new life, unaware that a storm was brewing just beneath his feet. Eleanor understood now that real power didn't come from making noise. It came from moving strategically, striking only when the moment was right. It was a chilly Friday morning when Daniel's attorney received Eleanor's formal request for one final meeting. This time, Eleanor insisted it be at the conference room of the very building Daniel believed he controlled. The irony was delicious, but Eleanor kept her satisfaction hidden beneath a calm exterior. She arrived early, sitting alone at the head of the table, her presence filling the room with a quiet authority she had never known she possessed. Daniel swaggered into the room minutes later, Melissa trailing behind him like a shadow. His expression was one of casual superiority, certain that Eleanor had come to plead, to beg for scraps. Eleanor didn't rise. She simply gestured for him to sit, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "Let's begin," she said. She could see the first flicker of uncertainty cross Daniel's face, and it gave her strength. Eleanor placed a single folder on the table and opened it with deliberate slowness. Inside were the documents detailing her ownership stake, the proof of his forged signatures, and the list of financial crimes he thought buried forever. Daniel's smirk faltered as he flipped through the pages, color draining from his face. Melissa leaned over his shoulder, her mouth falling open in silent horror as she read the damning evidence. When Daniel finally looked up, his bravado had vanished, replaced by something Eleanor hadn't seen in a long time: fear. You can't use this," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice low but firm. "It's already done. You have 30 days to vacate the building." "And the lawsuit?" "It will be public." For the first time in years, Eleanor felt truly free, the shackles of betrayal broken by her own hand. Word of the impending legal battle spread quickly among the business community. Eleanor's attorney advised her to gather affidavits from those who had seen Daniel's misconduct firsthand. Slowly but surely, former colleagues, jilted partners, and even a few past employees came forward, willing to testify. Each new voice added weight to Eleanor's case, constructing an iron wall of truth against the fabrications Daniel had spun for years. In every meeting, Eleanor maintained a calm demeanor, thanking each witness sincerely, never revealing the deep wounds that still throbbed beneath her steady surface. Some offered apologies for having stood by silently while Daniel's lies flourished, but Eleanor held no bitterness for them. She understood now that fear could silence even the best intentions, and she would never again let fear dictate her life. In a desperate attempt to salvage his crumbling empire, Daniel tried to push blame onto Melissa. Eleanor's attorney received notice that Daniel had claimed in deposition that the secretary had mismanaged funds without his knowledge. When Eleanor heard this, a grim smile played across her lips. Loyalty had always been a one-way street for Daniel, and now Melissa would finally taste the betrayal she had helped perpetuate. At first, Eleanor had wondered if she should feel pity. Melissa, after all, was young, perhaps naive. But as she remembered the smirks, the whispered insults, and the role Melissa had played in her humiliation, Eleanor felt nothing but cold detachment. Everyone had to live with the consequences of their choices, and it seemed Melissa's price had come due. Eleanor remained focused on her goal: justice, not vengeance. The court hearing was grueling but decisive. Eleanor sat with quiet dignity as her attorney presented evidence after damning evidence. Daniel, once so self-assured, shrank visibly with every passing hour, his defenses crumbling under the relentless tide of facts. When the final judgment was read, Eleanor was awarded not only her rightful share of the marital assets but also substantial damages for Daniel's fraudulent activities. Walking out of the courtroom, the afternoon sun warm on her face, Eleanor felt an incredible lightness in her chest. The final ties binding her to Daniel had been severed. She didn't look back as he slumped in the courtroom bench, Melissa nowhere in sight. Eleanor realized that true freedom didn't come from punishing those who wronged her. It came from knowing she had survived them, outgrown them, and left them behind. Daniel's downfall was swift and public. Newspapers picked up the story, highlighting not only the scandal but the resilience of the woman he had underestimated. His reputation, once polished and respected, was now smeared with disgrace. Business opportunities dried up overnight, friends distanced themselves, and Melissa quickly vanished, leaving Daniel to weather the storm alone. Eleanor, however, did not celebrate his downfall. There was no triumph in seeing a man destroy himself. She had won not by ruining him, but by refusing to let him ruin her. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor focused solely on her own path. She signed the final documents selling the contested building, using the proceeds to fund the dream she had quietly nurtured during her darkest days. One evening, as Eleanor closed the door to her small but thriving new office, she paused for a moment on the front steps. The city buzzed with life around her, but for the first time in years, she felt truly grounded. She thought back to the promises Daniel had once made, of love, of partnership, of forever. Those promises had been lies, but she realized now they no longer held any power over her. Instead, Eleanor made a new promise to herself, that she would live fully, speak boldly, and never again allow someone else to define her worth. The betrayal that had once threatened to break her had instead forged her into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Smiling softly to herself, she stepped into the night, carrying only the lessons worth keeping, and leaving all the rest behind. Eleanor's consulting agency opened quietly but grew steadily. Women from all walks of life found their way to her door, seeking advice, strength, and understanding. Eleanor poured her heart into each meeting, offering not only legal guidance but emotional support. She had lived their fears, survived their doubts, and now stood as proof that even the deepest wounds could heal. Every success story from her clients became a stitch in the tapestry of her own recovery. It amazed her how naturally leadership came to her now. Once timid and uncertain, Eleanor had become a voice others listened to and respected. Invitations to speak at community events and women's groups flooded in, and though she hesitated at first, she eventually embraced the platform. Standing at podiums and telling her story, she no longer felt shame. She felt pride. Pride for the woman who had been broken and rebuilt herself stronger than ever. One chilly afternoon, Eleanor ducked into a small cafe near her new office to escape the rain. She ordered a coffee and found a seat near the window. As she stirred her drink absent-mindedly, a familiar voice called out her name. She turned and found herself facing Sophia, the woman who had risked so much to help her. Sophia smiled warmly, her eyes full of emotion. Without a word, she slid into the chair across from Eleanor. They spoke for hours, sharing stories of healing and growth. Sophia confessed how witnessing Eleanor's courage had inspired her to leave her own toxic marriage. Eleanor listened, her heart swelling with quiet happiness. They laughed, cried, and toasted to second chances. For the first time, Eleanor realized her battle had rippled outward, touching lives she hadn't even known were watching. Her pain had birthed not just her own freedom, but hope for others too. Weeks later, Eleanor received a letter in the mail, the handwriting instantly recognizable. It was from Daniel. The letter was long, filled with apologies, regrets, and clumsy attempts at explanations. He spoke of loneliness, of mistakes, of wanting forgiveness. Eleanor read it carefully, feeling no anger, no sadness, only a distant kind of pity. Daniel was trapped by his own choices, haunted by the life he had thrown away. She placed the letter back into its envelope and tucked it into a drawer without responding. There was nothing more to say. She had already given Daniel too much space in her heart and mind. His regrets, though genuine or not, were his to carry. Eleanor had crossed a bridge he would never find again. She had no desire to return to a past built on lies and betrayals. Her future waited, bright and unwritten. It was not fame, wealth, or public vindication that marked Eleanor's victory. It was the quiet moments, the laughter of women she had helped, the look of relief in a client's eyes, the soft pride she felt closing her office door each evening. Justice had not come with gavel strikes or headlines. It had come through healing, growth, and the unwavering decision to choose herself every single day. Sometimes, walking past familiar streets, she would catch glimpses of Daniel, aged and hollow, clinging to remnants of a life he once thought indestructible. He never approached her, and she never stopped. No bitterness lingered. Only a deep, resonant gratitude that life had freed her from a man who had never truly seen her worth. True justice, she realized, wasn't about making others suffer, it was about flourishing despite them. On the anniversary of her divorce, Eleanor visited the beach alone. She walked barefoot along the shoreline, feeling the cool sand between her toes, the crisp air filling her lungs. The past no longer weighed heavily on her shoulders, it drifted behind her like foam on the waves, distant and harmless. She had built a new life not from revenge but from resilience, from hope, from an unbreakable belief in her own value. Standing at the edge of the water, she whispered a silent promise to herself, to continue moving forward, to continue believing, to never again settle for anything less than the respect and love she deserved. The ocean roared its approval in the distance, and Eleanor smiled, free, whole, and unshakably strong. Her story had begun with heartbreak, but it ended here, not in sorrow, but in triumph.